The Fury I knew was always 3 steps ahead.
The fact that you don't know tells me all I need to know about this new, rather old Nick Fury.
If you haven't guessed already, Secret Invasion is not a good show. In fact, it is one of the most uninteresting and forgettable Marvel shows to date, which you might think is, a commonality between a lot of these Disney Plus outings, but some just... they just leave a mark. Now, I've never been one to hold the MCU shows in any real high regard, so when this show came upon arrival, I had very little interest in even tuning into it in the first place. But I got through it and endured what felt like an eternity of just shit writing, shit CGI, and the show constantly berating Nick Fury to the point where anything that he did previously is no longer because of him, but because of the Skrulls instead. So basically, he's a massive liar and a fraud. Now, the Skrull invasion was clearly meant to be quite a big deal for the MCU. In fact, some would argue that they should have been the main villains of the MCU going forward after Endgame. After all, they were set up in Captain Marvel, and many assumed that they would have a big role to play with in the next saga. But considering that it took 20 projects to get here post Endgame, it was pretty obvious what was going on. Because what really happened was they made the Skrulls, like every other villain nowadays, misunderstood, instead of just making them pure evil and out to take over the entire planet. And while they did their multiverse bullshit that makes no sense, the Skrulls were ultimately sidelined completely. And it's only when one of the studio creatives coincidentally came across Captain Marvel and No Way Home just a few years later, realised that the Skrulls were actually a thing that happened, and came to the conclusion that they had to bring them back in some kind of project. But because they were so busy with their multiverse Kang bullshit that still makes no sense, and their other shows and movies which contributed nothing to the story going forward, they had no use for these aliens anymore. And so they went ahead and put together Secret Invasion to wrap up their storyline as quickly as possible, doing their best to make this thing even remotely interesting or engaging, to which they failed at both, leaving them wondering why neither the critics nor the audience liked it all that much. But with that being said, I should probably go over, the basic premise if you don't know it already, which wouldn't surprise me considering just how forgettable this entire thing really is. So basically, Nick Fury's come back to Earth after his little detour to space, which by the way, was because, as the show likes to repeat on every occasion possible, he was never the same after the blip. And he's basically retired now, and instead of being the cool, composed hero that we all knew him for previously, he's just now a sad, broken down old man who's barely a shell of who he once was, and apparently it's all his fault that the Skrulls never found a real home on Earth. Yeah, because there's definitely no other planets out there in the vast universe that other movies definitely haven't explored that the Skrulls could have most definitely settled on, and this was definitely not written as a lazy plot device to make the show happen, and as a tool to make Nick Fury look pathetic. Moving on, the majority of them are now living in this abandoned Russian power plant, and the lead of the Skrulls, called Gravik, is angry because the Skrulls never found a home, which, as I must reiterate, is all Fury's fault by the way. And it turns out that now a bunch of big world leaders are actually Skrulls, and so Fury, with the help of his allies and Gaia, the daughter of Talos, must put an end to Gravik's power, discover the truth behind the world leaders, and give the Skrulls a safe place to live. Now, if you don't understand half of what I just said, then I don't blame you, because this show is basically preying on the fact that you not only watched Captain Marvel, but also remember what happened in that thing, as well as remembering who the Skrulls are, or any of their names, and since pretty much no one does, this show from the very start lacks any kind of intrigue. For one thing, the whole premise is based on the fact that the Skrulls had nowhere else to go, which is complete bullshit. The show likes to act like the Guardians movies never happened, when we've clearly seen many planets where the Skrulls could have easily found a home, but then the show goes and features the same powers of those characters. I'm not even going to go into how they know about their powers and how they work, because this video would just last forever at that point, but just know that the show likes to make a lot of references that don't make any sense, probably because they knew that the plot wasn't very interesting, and they thought they could compensate with references to other characters, because cameos, am I right? This show also exists because apparently there's only one Skrull who's actually kind of evil and wants to take over the planet, because instead of making the Skrulls an evil alien race and creating a genuinely interesting and long-lasting storyline like in the comics, we have the multiverse to worry about. Can't wait to see how all that culminates. Forever. But this one evil Skrull is called Gravik, and he's basically the leader of them all, and seemingly those under him are all just kind of normal Skrulls who just want to find a home. So anyway, Gravik has managed to pull the strings, and now has other Skrulls pretending to be some of the world's biggest leaders, all in his master plan to take over the planet. But because Gaia, another Skrull, has betrayed Gravik, all of the people on the good side, including most of the Skrulls hiding in the power plant, want Gravik dead, which honestly, if the Skrulls decided to, rebel against him much earlier and killed Gravik before he even gained superpowers, yeah, that happens. This whole show would have never had to happen, and it could have all been fine and dandy, since clearly none of the Skrulls want him in power and thought that his mentality and ego were out of control, which is true by the way, since his actual plan is really stupid if you think about it, as he already has worldwide power through his own kind being world leaders. And going back to the whole thing about going to another planet, which they most definitely can do, he has the resources to do so, and no one's going to stop them, because that's not their problem, and no one cares. Honestly, this whole villain purely exists just to hold some childish grudge against Nick Fury, because Nick apparently abandoned them and didn't help them find a new home, and apparently there's a million of you all relying on this one human to solve all of your problems. But as I said before, you have the resources to find literally anywhere else to go, so what the fuck is what's even the point of all this? Now, something else that the show really goes for is like a Winter Soldier type vibe, which is a good choice considering that everyone likes that movie, and we haven't really had that same feeling from an MCU project since, but because the writing just doesn't match up, it fails miserably at delivering the same quality. The best way I can describe this show is, don't judge a book by its cover, because while I'm a fan of the visuals and the vibe it's going for, the plot itself is just boring as fuck. So much happens in this show that you're clearly meant to care about, or that's clearly meant to have some kind of emotional impact on you, but all you're left with is just a feeling of nothingness. And when I tell you that I had to look up on Google what happened in the previous episodes to remember that 2 major characters died, that's only the beginning. Now, you would think that with a plot like this, we would get some, major reveals that long-lasting characters in this universe have actually been a Skrull this whole time. But for those who seemingly are, it turns out that they were simply just captured before the events of the show even happened. And honestly, this might have been one of the most predictable things about the entire show, because firstly, we know that Marvel has no balls to pull off anything risky or remotely interesting nowadays, but also, Rhodey does act pretty unusual for the whole show. But to be fair, there were times when I was wondering if it was just the writing that was so goddamn awful, which was playing tricks on my brain. Writing this script out is just making me think more and more about how bad this thing really is. But ultimately, the biggest reason why this show doesn't work is because they made the Skrulls a set of villains that are misunderstood. Because while I can understand that there will be those who retaliate and go against the majority in any group, they could have just made the Skrulls pure evil instead, and this could have been, a major plotline that ran throughout the saga, culminating into a pretty epic story on the big screen, where we see all of our major heroes trying to combat the problem. But instead, we get this 6-episode miniseries, which is one of the worst rated shows in the entire MCU, starring what is easily the best cast of any MCU show yet, under a premise that should be super engaging and relevant to the rest of the MCU, but instead it's just a boring, forgettable mess that has to resort to references of major heroes and cameos from characters that no one cares about, in hopes that the audience stick around until the end. But in reality, people are just gonna completely forget about this whole thing a week from now, and the show basically ends exactly where it started, because the Skrull invasion just went from irrelevant to even more irrelevant. Nick Fury went from sad and old to still sad and even older. And honestly, the best thing this show could have done for anyone is just let Nick Fury die and get it over with. But no, he needs to be in the Marvels, another project which will somehow be even less interesting than this one, only to end with, again, 0 consequences. But I guess that all we can do is let Marvel and Disney just keep trying their best to produce something that isn't complete garbage, let them fail over and over, let them lose more and more money, and see them crumble to the ground, because at least that's more interesting than watching this piece of shit. Anyway, thank you for watching the video. Like, subscribe, all that jazz. Went forward though, of course. And I will see you in the next one very, very soon. Bye.